global reverberations of Palestine, intellectual thoughts and solidarity. And we are all in for a treat with 3 excellent presentations. I know you might have had a chance to have read the abstracts that the presenters submitted early on. And each of the presenters will speak for about 20 minutes, and that'll give us ample time for Q&A. Let me introduce myself first, and then I'll introduce the panelists. My name is Mehran Kamrava. I am Director of the Iranian Studies Unit at the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies, and I'm also a Professor of Government at Georgetown University here in Qatar. It's a pleasure being here, and particularly being with our panelists. Our first presenter is Shaira Vadasaria, who will talk about the racial question of Palestine and the question of racial justice for Palestine. Shaira?
Thank you. Thank you, Behran, and Sabah al-Khair. Good morning, everyone. It's an honor to be here, especially at this horrific time, which seems ungrievable in the Northern Hemisphere, especially in the UK, where I'm arriving from. This paper emerges from a set of pedagogical reflections on teaching in the area of race and colonial studies during my time as a visiting assistant professor at Al-Quds University Bard College between 2016, 2018, and 2019, where I had the immense privilege to teach, but really learn from a brilliant set of Palestinian students in the context of higher education inside of Palestine. The student body whom I taught to accessed the university campus, which is based in Abu Dis, a town in the West Bank that neighbors Jerusalem and is bordered by the wall, from different parts of the West Bank and East Jerusalem. And on the rare occasion, we had students from Gaza that had moved back to the West Bank with their families, as well as students that were born outside of Palestine and had spent their childhood years and their formative years living in Latin America or the US. So this constellation of students provided a kind of very particular meeting point between Palestine's splintered colonial geography and those born in expulsion. As a guest in Palestine, I entered the classroom with an understanding of race and colonial history that was very much shaped by my own Gujarati Muslim East African roots, born into a family expelled from Uganda and raised in the context of Turtle Island, or as they call it, Canada. And so I briefly bring this up just to highlight the kind of plurality of consciousness that came into the classroom with us. At this time, my course syllabi was populated by scholarship within critical race theory, indigenous studies, anti-colonial, post-colonial, settler colonial studies, queer theory, feminist theory, which we read alongside contemporary studies within Palestine studies, and a range of cultural texts, including political poetry, literature, film. And the idea was that by centering subjugated knowledges produced under and in response to colonialism, we turn to the sensibilities of globally oppressed people and communities and cultivated an appreciation for the ways that we're not only that, right? We're not only an oppressed people. But this time also helped me think more concretely about the frictions of theorizing race through liberal paradigms of anti-racism and racial justice as relevant to the anti-colonial struggle inside of Palestine, particularly when transposed through Euro-American epistemic registers of racial critique, from which I was trained in the settler context of Turtle Island. And so in many ways, I entered the Palestinian classroom with a kind of training indebted to critical race theory in the context of Canada, but found myself having to exit that canon frequently and often as a mode of translating and thinking through the struggle inside of Palestine. While there exists a strong corpus of Palestinian scholarship that explains the centrality of race in the very making of the question of Palestine, including, for instance, under British Empire, the Mandate era in Palestine, modern political Zionism, and its territorial expansion as a settler colonial project today. And this work all dates back to the tricontinental Third World Marxist revolutionary era of the 60s and 70s, which was a very particular kind of fertile meeting ground for an anti-racist discourse as foregrounded in anti-colonial and anti-imperial praxis. Less attention has been given to the extent to which liberal grammars of anti-racism or racial justice paradigms that are grown out of a Euro-American context fit as the antidote to settler colonial violence inside of Palestine today. And this piece really grapples with why, how, and upon what epistemic access points such ambivalences might reside. So let me first ground this discussion in a set of classroom encounters that gives inspiration to this work. And I'll start with a quote that gets me into trouble often. Professor, our struggle here is not about race, it's about land. Okay, so this claim, which remains with me today, was made in many iterations at different moments during the 2 years I spent teaching this study. To be clear, I don't interpret this claim to suggest a clear separation between race and land, despite the phrasing. The students articulated very clearly how racial logic and racialization and racism operates as the organizing principle of land dispossession under a settler project. Further, I don't think they or anyone who understands the Palestinian struggle for freedom would deny the role of racism or racialization deeply embedded in the Zionist project as experienced by Palestinians worldwide, and certainly no less within the settler colonial project inside of Palestine. On the contrary, we can see how the struggle for Palestinian freedom is being taken up globally by new generations that are very much speaking through a kind of solidarity politic based on this shared grammar of anti-racism. My students came to appreciate this relationship between settler colonialism and racism well, but they pushed the conversation further and elsewhere. Okay, so as I came to understand and think about, there were lines of query within critical race studies, and more specifically critical race theory, that they would not cross, let alone get on board with. And I think that these ambivalences are instructive for us. They're important lessons in how we think about this project of anti-racism today in the ongoing struggle. And just to kind of briefly contextualize, critical race studies is a capacious interdisciplinary field and set of debates that range in scale and scope. But the body of critical race studies I'm referring to, specifically critical race theory, emerges relatively recently in the 1980s as inspired first by the work of African American legal scholars, including, for instance, Kimberly Crenshaw, who is now famous for the development of her analytic of intersectionality. This field made really important inroads within the tradition of critical legal studies and socio-legal studies, which came to form in the 1960s with an interdisciplinary view of law, and continues to draw important connections between the lasting legacy of colonialism in contemporary legal practices such as policing, over-incarceration. And of course, there are interventions within this field that attempt to show how racial processes of criminalization and institutions of punishment and reform are tied to the ongoing settler project, right? So those interventions are there. But these arguments often frame, particularly in the Euro-American context, they often frame colonialism as background that helps to explain contemporary practices of racial governance and power, and within a kind of post-colonial political order. And as we took up some of these works in the classroom, to think more concretely, sites of critical race theory that take as its object of critique, the debates around inclusion, exclusion, which is the dominant conceptual grammar of CRT, mattered very little to the student body governed by what Fayez Sayegh described in 1965 as a politics of racial elimination. Approaches to CRT that take up race through critical engagement of inclusion, multiculturalism, formal equality versus substantive equality held almost no relevance to the lives of this student body, particularly many who are coming from the West Bank, who express no interest in negotiating the terms of such conditions within an existing settler project that is Israel today. Inclusion into what, they would ask. As they articulated, the very politics of inclusion within the apartheid regime is by its very nature normalization, a process by which normal relations are manufactured in a context of abnormal circumstances. So while the struggle for inclusion might appear to be a seemingly progressive step for racial minorities and under settler colonial regimes, or even a neutral step in a moment of transitional justice or conflict resolution, it has particular consequences when we're talking about an indigenous people fighting for sovereignty under daily ethnic cleansing that works to clear the land under this settler project of nation building. The kinds of ambivalence addressed in the classroom are not necessarily new or an aberration from longer-standing differences that Indigenous studies and decolonial studies have held with critical race studies, and that's including at the level of scale and scope. So at the level of scale, the object of CRT predominantly engages with critiques of racialized processes and structures of nation-state building, which stand in contrast to decolonial studies approaches to transnational, global, and anti-imperial analysis. And at the level of scope, anti-racist frameworks, particularly within settler colonial context, are often subsumed decolonial politics within a kind of liberal pluralist framework. So unlike decolonial and indigenous studies, CRT, and to some extent, I would say also sociology of race, has struggled with the limitations of thinking in terms of race and anti-racism within indigenous cosmology and epistemology. And so, for instance, anti-racist critiques of nationalism foreclose recognition of the long and the hard struggles of anti-colonial nationalism and indigenous movements towards nationhood, which don't necessarily adopt the same registers of the European nation state as constituted under colonial modernity and racial capitalism. Within institutions of higher education such as in the UK, where now I am teaching and I am seeing everything from a different vantage point, we see the adoption of anti-racism being used interchangeably and even at times synonymously with decolonization, both of which become completely diffused and hollowed out and end up being identity work on equity, diversity, inclusion. So this turn, which is now dangerously beyond metaphor, which Tuck and Yang cautioned us over a decade ago, relies on the same racial capitalist logics of white supremacy to instrumentalize claims towards anti-racism through this kind of EDI work, all under the banner of decolonization. And I think when these ideas of inclusion and representation become thought of as a substitute for decolonization, like we've really entered a dangerous terrain. The other thing I want to say just very briefly, and I think it's relevant to the limits of these liberal conceptions of anti-racism, is that partially this is rooted in the historical development of the concept of racism itself as instituted under international law. So scholars in the field of race will say that practices of racism and racial violence long predate the advent of race as a category, as well as racism, as it's in its emergence as a kind of lexical item, right? A language for describing what colonized societies have been experiencing since the 15th century. The concept of racism, which comes very late to describe this context, becomes a recognizable concept in a post-World War II era, and as a critique of anti-Semitism and racial eugenics applied to Jewish people in Germany and other parts of Europe during the Holocaust and leading up to it. As Barner Hesse has rightfully asked, how does this definition of racism translate non-European accounts of racism or racial violence? And his point is that what is baked into the very political imagining of racism under Western law and politics is already a conceptual foreclosure that prohibits us from understanding racism as practiced in the colonies, not inside of Europe, and deeply embedded within colonial modernity itself, including the project of liberalism. So for scholars like Hesse and his companions, César and Fanon, what they are putting forth is a kind of decolonial conception of anti-racism, which I think, when applied to the Palestinian context, does positively contribute to the long fight against decoupling critiques of Zionism from anti-Semitism, and returning to a time we can name Zionism as racism, as the 1975 passing of UN Resolution 3379 did, before it was rescinded as a precondition for Israel's participation in the peace accords. The other thing I want to just kind of briefly say is that I do believe that this move towards a decolonial reading of anti-racism actually already lives within the legacy of anti-colonial critique within the Palestinian intellectual tradition. And here there is a growing canon of scholarship that establishes Zionism as a racial project. In the 1976 International Symposium on Zionism and Racism held in Tripoli, Edward Said characterized the project of modern Zionism and its arrival as a settler project in Palestine as both a product of imperial theory and a practice of colonialism. Tracing the intellectual inheritances of Zionism to 19th century European nationalism and imperialism, he used his address to sketch a racial critique of Zionism as a settler project born out of British Empire and what he described as in the mimicry of Europe. So he registered in this address race as a classificatory system supported by 19th century science, and he likened Zionism to, quote, a degraded repetition of European imperialism, a family of ideas belonging to the same dynasty, springing out of the same seeds, end quote. The enunciation of Zionism as a Jewish political nation state was only conceivable through a pre-existing European national framework that was already heavily indebted to primordial and modernist racial ideas of the nation state. So leaders of modern political Zionism made appeals to a Jewish state through relying on racial ideas about shared blood, lineage, hereditary features, and kinship as indicators of a chosen people, of a common origins that belong to a land from time immemorial. Leading architects of Zionist settlement relied on 19th century racial, gendered, and sexual pseudoscience to advance the idea that a Jewish nation state could cure or remedy the forms of degradation inflicted upon Jewish people in the ghettos of Europe. So the desire to transform the late 19th century anti-Semitic discourse of the effeminate queer Jewish male to the heterosexual muscular military hero was thought to be achieved through the creation of a Jewish nation state. The Jewish state would also come to serve a Western imperial order through the racialization of Palestinians as an indigenous people viewed by British Empire as culturally inferior, destitute, lacking in reason and skill, and scientifically unfit for human rights. So in short, to some, early 19th century Zionist leaders sold an interconnected racial project, an imperial promise that would advance economic, technological, and bureaucratic features of the Arab world via economic exploitation, accumulation, and simultaneously restore white heterosexual manliness, honor, and civility of European Jews through the racialization of Palestine's indigenous people. So in addition to this important work offered by scholars such as Edward Said, as well as in the revolutionary era, such as Fayez Sayag and Ghassan Kanafani, we also have newer waves in the social sciences that have taken up racial politics and racial processes under British Empire, and the founding racial colonial moment of the signing of the Balfour Declaration and its enshrinement under the Mandate era, which brought the subject of Palestinian personhood into question through means of juridical erasure, which has been identified through important works such as by Sahar Honeidi, Shireen Sekali, Noor Arakat, Rashid Khalidi. Paying attention to the epistemic violence of Zionism as a racial project, scholars such as Nadia Abu al-Hajj and Joseph Massad have explained in great detail the role of science and the social science in naming Zionist claims to nationhood. And through very important socio-legal scholarship and community-based ethnography, Dr. Nadira Shalhoub-Kevorkian has produced a deep corpus of scholarship that centers the reach of racial power and necro-power in governing the lives and the afterlives of Palestinians, and particularly in the context of occupied Jerusalem. And then alongside this body of work, there's ongoing scholarship linking Black and Palestinian transnational solidarity praxis with close attention to circuits of racial violence produced through shared technologies of policing, training, racial capitalism, and shared imaginaries of a politics of abolition. All of this work has been very important in explaining the historical material and epistemic entanglements between the Jewish question and the question of Palestine, which has materialized today as 21st century apartheid. And what becomes clear from this body of work is that discussions around anti-Palestinian racism and racial violence is not necessarily a new analytic or critique. I will wrap up now. But in thinking about my students' provocation, Professor, our struggle here is not about race, it's about land. I came to appreciate that their hesitancy and their skepticism towards a reading of anti-racism was about a reading of anti-racism that dislodges the materiality of colonial power and violence as foreground to their racial experience. And so while we could discuss race as a structural account of power, racism as indexed on the body as the primary cause for discrimination was not relevant, right? Their rejection of the struggle for freedom as an anti-racist one was not suggesting that race doesn't play a role, but as they articulated, the end goal at this moment is not racial justice under this configuration of Israeli statehood. On the contrary, their ambivalence is about the rejection of the terms of racism or anti-racism that foreground this within the anti-colonial struggle for justice. Freedom from Israeli apartheid and occupation can't be achieved through this model of anti-racism alone. Okay, so I will end here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Next, we have Yanis Iqbal, who will talk about Palestine in the global intellectual conjecture, Marxism, and post-colonialism. Yanis, you have 20 minutes.
So first, I would like to thank the organizers for giving me the opportunity to present my paper here. Let me begin with Marxism. Marxism has three historical referents. First, actually existing socialist states. Second, wars of national liberation. And third, organized workers' movements. The existence of these referents means that Marxism constructs a specific politico-theoretical system that is continuously deepened through the encounter with new contradictions. When these three referents went into crisis, neoliberal globalization emerged to fill the vacuum. The Marxist insistence on political systematicity was replaced with an oppositional form of discourse, the discourse of post-colonialism, that bases its existence on the subversion and transgression of stability and systems. Whereas the Third World had earlier broadly identified with the socialist emphasis on sovereign anti-imperialist development, it now identified with the spirit of neoliberal globalization, wherein all projects are swept away by the unregulated tide of capital. The gradual unraveling of the three historic compromises of the post-World War II era, Sovietism, social democracy, and national liberation, found a parallel reflection in the state of the Palestinian struggle. With the emergence of post-colonial studies during the 1980s, an inadvertent mirroring of the disarray faced by the Palestinian people became apparent. In the aftermath of the devastating Israeli siege of Beirut in 1982, the expulsion of the Palestinian Liberation Organization from Lebanon and the tragic Sabra and Shatila massacre, the Palestinian cause encountered formidable trials. The American empire employed its imperial machinery to relegate, delegitimize, and vilify the PLO. This encompassed designating the PLO as a terrorist organization, the closure of its UN offices, the rejection of negotiations with PLO representatives by the US government, and even forcing the US ambassador to the UN to step down due to interactions with a PLO representative. The weakening of the traditional anti-systemic forces at the hands of the global North was mirrored by post-colonial theory in its foundational anti-Marxism, a comprehensive disavowal of all forms of nationalism, and a resultant glorification of liminality, hybridity, migrancy, and multiculturality, an aggressive rejection of totalizing social explanations, and the denigration of organized politics. The weaknesses of post-colonialism are exemplified by Edward Said, whose humanist, secularist, and cosmopolitan credentials push the boundaries of post-colonial studies to their outermost limits. Said practices a form of detached critique, wherein an independent and oppositional subjectivity has to gather resources from a variety of sites without normative obligations to any one system. This represents the occupation of an exilic position. The shaky grounds of disrupted identity alert the detached critic to the instability of history and time, reminding them that reality is constituted by a cacophony of forces that can't be channeled into a single theoretical tunnel. When applied to the study of imperialism, the exilic disposition means that one has access to both sides of the imperialist divide, which allows the critic to move beyond their parochial cultures and see the West and non-West as globally connected entities. Said calls this a contrapuntal reading of imperialism. The musical metaphor of counterpoint entails two superimposed melodies, where their blend is regarded as an incidental harmony between two distinct melodic lines rather than a forced fusion by an overbearing sound. Along these lines, imperialism is imagined as the interaction of various themes with only a provisional privilege being given to any particular one. Imperialism is crisscrossed with multiple interdependent histories and overlapping domains, and with the continuous history of struggle. So this is the atonality of the imperialist ensemble, which does not follow any singular compositional rule. Given the dynamism of the global imperialist environment, it can't be reduced to sociological economic facts of exploitation and domination. There is no overarching theoretical principle that can capture imbrications, confrontations, rebellions, interactions, and aggressions that generate the complex and uneven history of the West and the non-West. Said's writings on Palestine carry the imprint of this exilic disposition. He is not concerned with finding philosophically cogent resolutions of political, cultural, and economic injustices. These meta-interpretative explanations are replaced by an experimental approach that resists any comprehensive methodological criteria. Assertions regarding justice and injustice have to be recognized as ideological claims that need unpacking accordingly. This unpacking translates into an unhoused perspective where we can observe politics and cultures not just as problems to be solved, but as a series of reflections to be engaged. The unsettled state of exile is also attentive to instances in history where peaceful coexistence has occurred. The multicultural, multi-ethnic, and multinational history of Palestine belies any notion of purity or homogeneity. The position of exilic disruption promotes a compassionate sense of historical connections, wherein the co-constituting relations of Israel and Palestine impart a similar fluidity to the peace process. To the extent as imperialism produces a complex atmosphere of multiple, polyphonous, overlapping identities, a just peace has to reflect that dynamic atmosphere. So, Edward Said says that the historical suffering experienced by dispossessed Palestinians is deeply connected with the historical trauma of Jewish Holocaust survivors. These material interfaces prepare the ground for what he calls a composite identity, which is characterized by overlaps and open-endedness. This composite identity is a long-term process based on epistemic irresoluteness, which means the willingness to acknowledge identities as incomplete stories without any definitively delineated closure. This fluid project requires, according to Edward Said, the crucial role of education in upending the constitutively bellicose and Orientalist clash of civilizations ideology. Said's sidelining of the supposedly narrow metric of systematic theory in favor of exilic analysis means that his opposition to imperialism is based on educational consciousness about the connectedness of the world. As a result, his politics becomes centered around the hegemonic roles of symbols and ideas. His strategy is encapsulated in the call for Palestinianism, which contrasted the inclusiveness and fluidity of a loosely formed Palestinian identity to the rigid nationalism of the Zionist regime. Resistance had to be undertaken by flexible, mobile political forces who relied more on initiative, creativity, and surprise than they did on holding fixed positions. Said's fragmented political approach means that there is no way in which we can undertake a comprehensive operation directed at the entire social totality. Resistance always has to be an undecided exploration of historical contradictions and connections. Thus, he provides us with no tools to move beyond the consciousness of contradictions and directly intervene in politics with a unified direction. Here, the Lebanese Marxist Mehdi Amal becomes useful. Unlike Said, he says that imperialism not only creates new relations and connections, but also imparts a systematic unity to the concerned entities. In his words, quote, "It became impossible to define the structure of the colonized country's specific trajectories of becoming except within the colonial relation. What was possible before this relation became impossible after," unquote. Said forgets this moment of impossibility. He regards imperialism as being in a state of permanent flux of new undecided possibilities and interconnections. Amil, on the other hand, shows how these possibilities and interconnections are restricted by a structural unity. Structural unity means that contradictions aren't just free-floating and open-ended connections, but tightly shaped dynamics with their relations of hierarchy. So, for instance, an indigenous society has its own basic economic contradiction that determines its social structure. The onset of colonization then introduces a new dominant contradiction between the indigenous social formation and the colonial entity. Once this colonial relation has been articulated, you have the political contradiction, which Amil thinks of in terms of the centripetal unifying class struggle, whereby the preceding contradictions are conjuncturally integrated in favor of the subaltern subject. The comprehension of unity in a framework of structural integrity is avoided by present-day international organizing around Palestine. Activism now revolves around a disembodied and deterritorialized form of internationalism based on the consciousness of the individual actor. Travel activism, visible in the propping up of first world nationals as global citizens, civil missions, and humanitarian witnesses, leads to a pre-political form of resistance that ignores the collective foundations of the Israeli settler colonial state. Moreover, they inadvertently perpetuate the unequal value placed on first world nationals within a cultural framework that emphasizes individual sacrifice and prioritizes humanitarian governance over challenging racialized hierarchies. Now, this individual travel activism stands in contrast to the anti-colonial and anti-imperialist struggles broadly rooted in Marxist revolutionary solidarity. The PLO, for example, saw its struggle as intricately linked to the global battle for freedom and human dignity fought by oppressed communities everywhere. Palestinian guerrilla factions didn't just train their fellow Palestinians, but extended their expertise to a wide array of groups. This included the Black Panthers, Eritreans, Yemenis, Gulf Arabs, Kurds, and other individuals fighting for their freedom who came to the camps seeking guidance. Liberation movements and activists from different parts of the world, such as Oman, South Africa, and Bangladesh, either aligned themselves with the PLO in Lebanon or received military education and material aid from them. Leftist artists and groups from third world countries collaborated with the PLO film unit, contributing to the production of militant cinema and documentation of liberation struggles. This form of solidarity constituted a unique approach that centered on advancing these movements through revolutionary actions, armed struggle, resource sharing, knowledge dissemination, and active engagement in local politics. Concrete practices of anti-imperialist popular power building underline the need for combating Zionism through an organized navigation of multi-layered contradictions. Israeli Zionism poses a national patriotic danger to the Arab people, opposing them externally. Western imperialism segments the Arabs internally along class lines by underdeveloping the region and creating undemocratic states controlled by local elites. That's why the issue of national sovereignty, cohesiveness, and socio-economic stability is expressed through the classes that can act as channels for their realization and those that act as obstacles in that task. It is instructive to consider here the position of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, which has served as the main leftist group in terms of membership, popular support, and international recognition, and was the first competitor for Fatah. The PFLP recognized the internal contradictions of the Arab region when, in addition to Israel, the World Zionist Movement, and world imperialism, it listed Arab reactionary forces as the enemies of the Palestinian people. An effective Palestinian movement has to consider the turbulences of intra-Arab political economy. With regard to this political economy, the PFLP produced an analysis of the progressive Arab regimes of Egypt, Syria, Iraq, and Algeria. So these regimes undertook state-managed capitalism, which destroyed feudal remnants, and they also provided a degree of support to Palestine. But due to the petit bourgeois leadership, they couldn't mobilize the workers and peasants for a mass-based revolutionary action. So relations with them had to be both of alliance and conflict. The attrition of this populist nationalism and the downfall of USSR has opened the way for the American empire to de-develop the Arab region and confine them to exporters of oil. That's why we don't have much anti-imperialist possibilities under US unipolarity. But with the rise of China, there has been a multipolarization of the world order. Unlike US's free market capitalism, the structure of the Chinese economy is such that it doesn't need to exploit foreign markets, territories, resources, and labor. In 2019, the total assets of Chinese state-owned enterprises were reported to be at 167% of the country's GDP, a significantly higher proportion compared to any other nation. The dominance of the state in the ownership of important banks and industries that means that profit maximization is not the main driver of the Chinese economy. That's why China's involvement in the Middle Eastern region reflects a peaceful attitude. Its brokering of the Saudi-Iran detente has performed two main functions. It has ended the isolation of Iran, which has been aiding the Palestinian cause ever since Egypt lost its position. And second, it has neutralized the US Zionist strategy of dividing Arabs and Iranians, Sunnis and Shia. Israel's negative reaction to this rapprochement is understandable, given that rivalries are essential for the scuttering of anti-imperialism. While the reduction of regional tensions doesn't directly translate into the instantaneous growth of anti-imperialist politics, such possibilities are latent within multipolarity. That is, the process of narrowing the options of Western imperialist capitalism and making economies more national and therefore more susceptible to democratic pressures. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Iqbal. I'm most grateful to our two presenters so far for keeping to time perfectly. And now we're going to shift gears a little and talk about, if you can turn off your mic. We're going to shift gears a little and talk about Azerbaijan and Azerbaijan's rise and fall of solidarity with the Palestinians. And for that, we have Rovshan Mamadli, who will walk us through. Thank you.
Thanks for giving them a floor. So I am going to discuss the intricate dynamics of Azerbaijan and Palestinian solidarity and how they have evolved in the context of its own conflict with Armenia. Azerbaijan and Palestine are mutually distinctive and incompatible regions. Levant versus the Soviet South Caucasus, the Middle East versus the former Soviet Union. But there are several compelling factors that make this topic worth to explore. Azerbaijan has very close and special ties with Israel. Azerbaijan's closest ally, Turkey, the successor of the Ottoman Empire, has highly invested in the Palestinian conflict in foreign policy. Azerbaijan has also historically strong, yet not always good relations with neighboring Iran, Israel's arch enemy. And finally, there is a huge Armenian community in the Middle East. As you know, Azerbaijan had a conflict with Armenia over the Karabakh region, which started amidst the collapse of the Soviet Union and ended with the war in 2020, when Azerbaijan regained those territories and took full control of Karabakh last year. All these factors make this topic worth to explore. Remarkably, in 1997, Azerbaijan's then president, Heydar Aliyev, the father of the current president, affirmed his country's unwavering support for the Palestinian cause. During the meeting with Yasser Arafat in Tehran, Iran, he said, "Azerbaijan is a friend of Palestine. The independent Republic of Azerbaijan has always supported and will always support the heroic struggle of the Palestinian people." This sentiment, deeply rooted in the conflict of the 90s, faced a gradual transformation in the following years. Following the flood of oil wells in the early 2000s, the emphasis on pan-Islamic solidarity for Palestine declined rapidly. And after Azerbaijan's victory over Armenia in 2020, its solidarity discourse with Palestine became marginalized, overshadowed by its increasing partnership with Israel. In this context, the Karabakh conflict, in particular, has served as a pivotal axis around which Azerbaijani foreign policy has realigned, prioritizing strategic alliances over ideological solidarity. Because since its independence, the resolution of the Karabakh conflict has been the main goal of Azerbaijan's foreign policy. Azerbaijan's pro-Palestinian solidarity in this regard has been profoundly expressed in the framework of the Organization of Islamic Countries. And regardless, much akin to the Nakba of 1948 and its subsequent commemoration, which have evolved into an integral part of Palestinian national identity, the forced displacement of Azerbaijani populations from Karabakh during the early 90s have played a central role in the shaping of Azerbaijani national consciousness. These instances of displacement and occupation, particularly through a religious lens, as an oppression of Muslims, have laid the foundation for this pan-Islamic solidarity discourse. Besides the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, Azerbaijan has always supported Palestine in the UN against Israel. It has always voted in favor of Palestine. But this policy has also served to garner support from the Muslim nations over the Karabakh conflict. At the same time, Azerbaijan, as I mentioned before, has strong ties with Israel. In the military sector, in the intelligence sector, Azerbaijan provides Israel main oil needs up to 40%. Israeli weaponry played a crucial role in regaining Karabakh in 2020. So Azerbaijan refrains from demonstrating more profound solidarity, such as explicitly condemning Israel's aggression, including the ongoing genocide in Gaza right now. Perhaps a diplomatic cable released by WikiLeaks shows this position very well. In 2008-9, when US embassy officials, according to WikiLeaks, when US embassy officials communicated with their Azerbaijani counterparts to oppose a UN resolution condemning Israel's 2008-9 invasion of Gaza, then an Azerbaijani Minister of Foreign Affairs contact explained that Azerbaijan would follow the Organization of Islamic Countries line, and there was an understanding with Israel about Azerbaijan's voting behavior. So, the reason why Azerbaijan's official pro-Palestinian solidarity discourse has decreased in the last years has several key reasons. Firstly, as I mentioned earlier, Israel provides Azerbaijan with an important amount of weapons to use in the war against Armenia to regain back Karabakh. Secondly, Azerbaijan's victory in the war reduced its need for political support, diminishing concerns about potential anti-Azerbaijani backlash from Muslim and Arab nations due to upgraded relations with Israel. Remarkably, Azerbaijan 2 years ago opened an embassy in Israel, Tel Aviv. Thirdly, the signing of the Abrahamic Accords and the normalization of Turkish-Israeli ties in 2021 have made the full diplomatic relationship between Israel and Azerbaijan more acceptable on the global stage. Fourthly, the strained relations between Tehran and Baku has also increased the cooperation between Israel and Azerbaijan based on shared distrust of Iran. Azerbaijan is cautious about developments that could compel it to move beyond customary statements and votes in international organizations, particularly amid strained relations between Ankara and Tel Aviv. In this context, the most significant negative impact from Baku's perspective regarding the Israeli military campaign genocide is the harm it inflicts on Ankara-Tel Aviv reconciliation that Azerbaijan has heavily invested in. On a societal level, I cannot say that Azerbaijani people are most passionate people about Palestine. For example, unlike its Turkish fellow nation, but it's characteristic of all former Soviet republics, including the Muslim ones in the Central Asia. Also, there is a narrative in Azerbaijan that Israel supports Azerbaijan and Palestinians support Armenia. And according to this mainstream view, Israel is the enemy of Iran and which supports Armenia, and that's why Israel is our friend, etc. There is a geopolitical dichotomy which puts Israel and Azerbaijan in the one side and Palestine, Iran, Azerbaijan, and Armenia on the other side. But of course, there are progressive forces, but mainly the Muslim communities, particularly Shia activists, have assumed the role of focalizing solidarity with Palestine through diverse social performances such as protests, statements, speech, religious ceremonies, etc. In particular, the annual Goods Day commemorated on the last Friday of the Ramadan has been significant in terms of resonating the Palestinian cause amongst the Azerbaijani people through a history of protests against Israel. The solidarity discourse has been based on pan-Islamic victimhood identity, drawing a link between the struggles for Karabakh and Jerusalem in the face of occupation. Oppositional Islamic discourse has also posited that Israel directly plays a role in encouraging the Azerbaijani government to adopt authoritarian practices, including the crackdown on religious communities. In this context, backing the Palestinian cause has also emerged as a focal point where opposition to foreign policy decisions is intricately connected to the underlying issue of authoritarian governance. After the Second Karabakh War in 2020, the public display of solidarity with Palestine within the heavily securitized and surveilled religious community has decreased. As Azerbaijan relationship with Israel deepens, the government escalates its pressure on the Shia community particularly and actively and on all civic society, the oppositions, etc., and actively sought to suppress any anti-Israeli activities within the country. This has been evident over the past 4 years, particularly following the 2020 war, during which no street demonstrations against Israel's aggressive policies, including those after 7th of October, were held. There is no public expression of anti-Israeli sentiment, pro-Palestinian sentiment, except on social media. So what's next? What's the future? How will be the dynamics of this process will evolve? I assume against the backdrop of the Karabakh conflict and escalating perception of Iran as a threat, it's foreseeable that the Azerbaijan-Israeli partnership will deepen. This will likely further constrain Azerbaijan's official expression of solidarity with Palestine. But nevertheless, given Azerbaijan's alignment within the Muslim world and its primary alliance with Turkey, Baku's position is unlikely to diverge significantly from that of Ankara. And I should mention that despite all these factors, Azerbaijan can be considered the most pro-Palestinian country in the South Caucasus. Unlike Armenia, Azerbaijan recognizes Palestine as a state. Unlike Georgia, Azerbaijan has a diplomatic office in Ramallah, and Palestine has an embassy in Azerbaijan. And all international platforms on stages, always Azerbaijan votes in favor of Palestine, supports the two-state solution. In this context, Azerbaijan inclines to quietly fortify its links with Tel Aviv while simultaneously preventing public expression of pro-Palestinian anti-Israeli sentiments, particularly within the religious community, which it perceives as a potential threat to political stability. While the victory in Karabakh has seemingly diminished the salience of the Karabakh-Palestine parallel, in the broader public discourse, I anticipate that the Palestinian cause will endure as a significant facet of religious activism, primarily owing to its integration into the politicized Shia identity. That's all. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Thank you. My thanks to all three panelists. Before we open it to questions and answers, I would like to use the chair's prerogative to ask each of the panelists a question and get their thoughts on a couple of points. Shaira, thank you very much for excellent presentation. I look forward to seeing it published and in print. I think you have an article right there, and I'm looking forward to seeing it. I have a question, and you alluded to this at the earlier part of your presentation. Isn't it indeed the case that whenever there's a conquest of national proportions, whether it is the Europeans going to the Americas and conquering Native Americans, whether it is the Europeans going to Australia and New Zealand and conquering the colonials, or Europeans going to South Africa, or Europeans going to Palestine, whenever you have a conquest of that scale, isn't it the case that race is often used, or invariably used, as one of the justifications for the conquest. And we hear reverberations of this. Not that long ago, before the Gaza genocide, the president of the European Commission gave a speech commemorating or celebrating Israel's 75th birthday, and she resorted to these racist tropes of you guys went and made the desert bloom, and basically she didn't use the word civilized, but that's what she was implying. And so what you're describing, isn't it just part of the project of conquest? And it goes without saying that it's there, part of the whole project anyway. Yannis, I also very much enjoyed your presentation, and for about 90% of the presentation, I heard nothing that I disagreed with. And then towards the end, when you were talking about this, I think the one question that I would have is that isn't the foreign policy of any country invariably based on its own national interests? And that rhetoric notwithstanding, does anybody other than Palestinians really care about Palestine when it comes to their foreign policies? I'm from Iran, and it pains me to say this. Do the Iranians really care about Palestine, or is it for domestic political purposes that they keep yelling and screaming and promising liberation of Palestine? And isn't that the case with every other country? That you take it from Nasser on until today, everybody talks about the liberation of Palestine and expresses solidarity. But when push comes to shove, it's actual national interests that trump every other consideration when it comes to it. And so, isn't it, I would like to hear your thoughts about that in terms of the predominance of national interests as compared to rhetoric and expressions of solidarity that often amount to not much more than pleasant diplomacy or hot air. And Ravshan, again, and by the way, this is, all we need to do is to listen to Ravshan's analysis of enemy of my enemy is my friend, to kind of get a different insight into this. So again, I very much enjoyed your presentation. And as you mentioned rightly, Iran-Azerbaijan relations, Iran-Azerbaijani relations have been fraught with tension. And there is a territorial element, there's ethnic element, there's a Turkish question, and there's a number of variables to consider. But suppose in an ideal world there's meaningful substantive rapprochement between Baku and Tehran. Would that then have consequences, do you think, for Azerbaijan's relations with Israel? So if we can start with Shaira.
Thank you so much for your question. And I think part of what you're also asking is there anything exceptional about political Zionism as a racial project inside of Palestine, given that with all forms of modern colonial practice, race is intrinsic to the process. And I think that's important to de-exceptionalize the racial politics and the racial practices of Zionism. It's not atypical in that regard. But I think it's also useful when we think about the genealogy of race under modernity. The accepted category of race as a thing, like as a social category of difference, actually comes very late in in the project of modernity. And so actually practices of racism or racial violence, which take the form of expulsion, expulsion of wide-scale expulsion of people or indigenous dispossession, long predates actually the accepted category of race, which emerges through 19th century science. So that category actually comes in the aftermath of the racial violence or the racism itself as a justification for these processes. But simultaneously religion and now I think we're in a moment of culturalization of race plays just as significant of a role in how we come to think about ideas about difference.
Okay, thank you. Iqbal?
The presupposition that nation states have their own self-interest, which they pursue exclusively and pragmatically, I think this is a very narrow assumption of realist international theory. Because what exactly is self-interest? In realist theory, self-interest is an empirical datum that you can clearly dissect and analyze in whatever conjuncture you have. But in a Marxist geopolitical theory, interest is a variable entity, because in the post-World War II conjuncture, it was in the self-interest of the global South states to unify themselves and ally themselves with the state socialist bloc to fight against the imperialist incursions of the global North. And the task of revolutionary politics is to show how it is in the self-interest of states to unify themselves in an anti-imperialist manner, and that has taken place in a very provisional way throughout history. Tricontinental Marxism is an instance of this. The foreign relations of the PLO between the peoples of different states and with other states also, it is an instance of this. So I think we need to see self-interest as a more comprehensive category rather than the one that realist theory allows as the pragmatic interests of states, because states themselves have classes. Classes themselves have their social systems, and we need to analyze these systems.
Thank you.
Thanks for the question. Yeah, there is a substantial rapprochement between Tehran and Baku in the last year, and at least there is not that much tension in the relations. But I think there will always be underlying tension in the relations, and regardless of the government, regardless of the developments, geopolitical developments, and I think it's because of the. First of all, it's because of the identity issue. I think that it has an impact on the relations between the countries. And in this context, I would prefer to analyze of Azerbaijan-Iranian relations from the constructivist perspective, not from the realist perspective. And identity and history has played a crucial role in reshaping Azerbaijan's foreign policy vis-à-vis Iran. Also, Azerbaijan has concrete, not democracy, but pro-Western, pro-NATO, not pro-NATO, pro-Western, pro-Israel, and also Azerbaijan wants to keep good relations with America, the USA, and it will not change, at least regardless of the change in the systems in the both country. And this will not affect on Azerbaijan's long-term political foreign policy objectives. And I think also regarding the Palestinian issue, regarding the Israel, and Azerbaijan's and Israel's relations are much more deeper than it is known, and Israel's importance is for Azerbaijan is not just about sale of weaponry and or oil market, and it's multidimensional, and It will not change that much, I think. But there can be new modus vivendi between the countries, and it will not be always ideal, but it can be the good neighboring relationship and based on pragmatic calculations, I think. Thank you.
Perfect, thank you. In fact, you mentioned good neighborly relations. That is one of the slogans of the Raisi administration, good neighborly relations. And we saw that in relation to Pakistan as they were sending missiles to each other. All right, we have about 19 minutes, and let's take some questions. If you wouldn't mind introducing yourself, and go ahead, sir. There's a mic coming your way, yeah.
Thank you, good morning. Thank you for this important presentations. My name is Sami Abu Shahad. I am the chairman of the National Democratic Assembly Party inside the Green Line. I want to talk about the first presentation of Shari about Zionism and racism. And I think one of the biggest challenges of this thing, we have two main issues. First, the narrative that was built regarding the Holocaust in the West, which prevents Europeans and Americans, not just the Jewish people, but also Westerners in general, to imagine Jews being racist. This is one of the biggest challenges for us, because Westerners cannot really believe that Jews can be racist by definition. They can see them only as the ultimate victim of racism, while in most of the states that I traveled all over the world, Israel has built maybe the most racist society I have ever seen. But the image is that it's a liberal democratic society. So we have this challenge in explaining this thing, and I want to ask you also, usually when I try to use the discourse of racism, talking about Zionism, Westerners, Americans, Europeans usually prefer the discourse of discrimination. They say that, okay, this phenomena could be described more as discrimination. This is the maximum that they can deal with. But when you use the terminology of racism, they feel attacked, because we have seen it, and this is exactly what we have been seeing at the beginning of the war now on Gaza. From mainly Westerners' point of view, Palestinian baby, Palestinian child, and any Palestinian victim is not equal to the same as an Israeli victim. This racist framing should also be dealt in a much bigger general discussion, not just from Zionism. I think it should be also totally connected to the way the West deals still. So we mentioned Said here a few times about Orientalism. Zionism, no doubt, has very serious Orientalist elements, but same are still now Western societies. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's take a few questions, and then we'll take another round. The gentleman, and if you would be kind enough to also keep your questions brief, so there's time.
Of course. Thank you very much. My name is Javier Abu Eid. I'm a PhD student at Trinity College. My comment is on the question, actually, is on the third presentation. When in the Camp David negotiations, the Israelis were calling for the Armenian Quarter to be part of Israel, President Arafat responded that his real name was Yasser Arafatian, and he took a strength out of the Armenian component that is also part of Palestine. At the same time that he had very good relations with Azerbaijan. So sometimes the idea of trying to present that Palestinians are pro-Armenian, therefore they're anti-Azerbaijan, I think it's not going to work in the case of Palestine. There are so many historical moments whereby, for example, Armenians gave 40 martyrs in 1948 defending Jaffa Gate. And many people believe that if it wasn't for the Armenians, the Zionists would have taken the old city of Jerusalem through Jaffa Gate in 1948. PFLP trained Armenian fighters in Lebanon during the 70s. So I think, and it didn't mean that the PLO could not have good relations with Azerbaijan as well. So my question is, what do you define by support? You said, for example, that Azerbaijan supports Palestine on the UN voting. Armenia also supports Palestine on the UN voting, and there is no contradiction between them. You said that Azerbaijan recognized Palestine. Fine, Armenia doesn't recognize Palestine, but the Azerbaijan recognition came as part of an OIC decision, and 57 countries recognized, 56 recognized Palestine. And the last point, it's true that Azerbaijan recognizes Palestine, but it only opened an office in Ramallah after they inaugurated their embassy in Tel Aviv. And I also think that that's an important point to be made.
Perfect, thank you. I don't see any other questions, so let's, oh, sorry, sir, go ahead. I apologize. Again, if you could just keep your question, not a comment, but a question.
Yeah, it's a very pointed question to our friend from Armenia, from Azerbaijan, sorry. I would just like to know, is it only strategic considerations that determine Azeri-Israeli relationships, or the Azeri Jews also have a role to play in determining the Azerbaijani policy? Thank you.
Go ahead, Shahir.
Okay. Thank you for your question. I think it's a really important point of discussion we should be having, we have to have at this moment. You know, why can't Euro-America see also Palestinians as racialized subjects, right? This is embedded within the problematic of the fact that the Holocaust remains the accepted template, historical template, upon which we understand racism through. And this is the critique, Barnard Hesse's critique, exactly, that you know, because our political imagining is co-signed to that political moment, it forecloses the possibility to think about you know, Jewish people as also aggressors of racism, right? So this is fundamentally part of the epistemic knot I think we're entangled in. But you know, the other question is, what gave legitimacy to the technologies of racial violence used upon Jewish people in Europe, and what are the histories of enslavement and dispossession that even made such violence thinkable, right? That gets completely eclipsed from this kind of bind, right? This bind of how we understand racism today. So, I mean, I think the problem in front of us is how to speak about Zionism as racism in clear terms, and we see a rise of US policy and UK policy that even prohibits that discourse. And I think part of tackling that challenge is to think historically about the ways that Zionism is not just a racist project against indigenous people of Palestine, it's also a bit based on anti-Semitic tropes, right? How Zionism came to legitimize itself as a kind of redeeming, as a redemptive project, already accepted racialized, gendered, and sexual ideas about difference inflicted upon Jewish people through the use of racial science, no less, right? So I think we need to keep that kind of history in mind as we're thinking about how to keep going with this project, because this has been a long struggle too. It's not just this moment in front of us where we have to do this work of decoupling critiques of Zionism from anti-Semitism and naming Zionism as racism. So, and I think we also have to push back on this individual, you know, the idea that, okay, we can think about racism in terms of individual terms like discrimination. You know, this is empty if we're not talking about how it's linked to wider colonial imperial structure. And I think that that's kind of the caution that I'm trying to raise in this piece is that any articulation of anti-racism has to be linked to these wider structural critiques of imperialism and colonialism for it to do the work we needed to do in challenging Zionism. So does that answer your question?
Thank you. Okay.
Thanks for the questions. So first of all, I want to make a small correction on my, maybe I expressed myself not as I wish. I didn't imply that Palestinians support Armenia. I just expressed the narrative in Azerbaijan regarding the Palestinians. And of course, this is propaganda, and there is and it's so normal that nations have relations with each other. And it doesn't mean anything, but it's a propaganda and it's a narrative. That's a reality in Azerbaijani society. And it puts the Armenia and Palestine in the one side and Israel and Azerbaijan on the other side. And you rightly mentioned that Azerbaijan inaugurated the diplomatic office in Palestine after establishing an embassy in Israel. And again, it's a double game of Azerbaijan's, and it always utilized the pan-Islamic solidarity to garner support from the Muslim nations, and it has a kind of balanced foreign policy, just not unilaterally pro-Israeli and pro-Palestinian, and always Azerbaijan wants to refrain involving in Palestinian conflict, and from refraining from expression of either pro-Palestinian or either pro-Palestinian or pro-Israeli position. And regarding the second question, that is the Jewish community in Azerbaijan plays a role in shaping Azerbaijan foreign policy vis-a-vis Israel. I think it is when you have a concrete foreign policy object, you can make everything as a narrative for making good relations between between the countries. For example, Azerbaijan is second by percent is the largest Shia country, but it doesn't help for good relations with Iran, and also in this way, the Jewish in the official narrative, the Azerbaijani government, also Azerbaijani media, often emphasize that Azerbaijan is a land of tolerance, and there historically hasn't been any anti-Semitism and always tolerance, but it's a narrative, and that's not an objective reality. Just if you want to get closer with the country, and you will make every you can make every detail, every element as a reason for increasing the relations, for making stronger the ties, and so the why Jewish community plays a role because Azerbaijan has intention to get closer to Israel, not because Azerbaijan has a Jewish community it wants to get closer to Israel. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Please join me in thanking the presenters for brilliant presentations, and thank you all very much. Thank you.